Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 45, and today I'm going to be asking, what was Paul's view of the future of Israel? As I mentioned a few times recently, I'm teaching a course at the moment at Duke on the life and letters of Paul, and one of the topics that inevitably comes up in a course like that is, what was Paul's view of Israel? What was Paul's view of the Jewish people? And in particular, what was his view of the future of those Jews who hadn't done what he had done and decided to follow Jesus? Because it's something that really exercises Paul. It really gets into his thinking, and he has to kind of work through a kind of solution on. And it's one of those issues which has become important in our culture because of the importance of Jewish-Christian relations and discussing Jewish-Christian relations. It's caused people to go back to the New Testament and look seriously at what Paul says. And of course, because of the appalling, blood-stained 20th century, and not just the 20th century, but the appalling history of anti-Semitism, and in particular the kind of post-Holocaust context in which we do a lot of our New Testament scholarship, it's made people think again seriously about what it is that the New Testament actually says, and searching for ways in which we can come to terms with some of the scholarship that was really quite seriously anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. It's made people kind of reassess what Paul has said. Quite often, contemporary events, contemporary politics, contemporary cultural realities, of course, make you go back to the text and make you do your history in a more sensitive way. Now, the topic has really changed in Pauline studies over the last generation or so. I mean, when I think back to my own undergraduate days, which aren't really that long ago, when we looked at the epistle to the Romans, we focused on Romans 3 to 8, as if that is the absolute heart of the epistle. And it's Romans 9 to 11 that has all the material about the future of Israel. And when I was a student, we just translated Romans 3 to 8 in Greek, and we had lots and lots of exegesis classes on Romans 3 to 8, and I think I got into the habit of thinking that Romans really effectively ended at the end of chapter 8, and I think there was a whole generation that was like that just thought that Romans really ends at chapter 8, and they tended to put Romans 9 to 11 into a kind of appendix, a sort of secondary place that wasn't so important, and that's really changed now. I think a lot of scholars really want to say that Romans 9 to 11 is really key in Paul's thinking. But what is it that's going on in Romans 9 to 11? Well, part of the issue is that there are certain things that are just non-negotiable for Paul. One of them is the sovereignty of God. There's no way that that's in any way negotiable. Paul's never going to say, well, perhaps God just is not sovereign over the world. Perhaps he just couldn't make up his mind. Perhaps he couldn't. For Paul, it's always about trying to work out what's in the mind of God. It's never about doubting anything of God's power and God's purpose and God's ability to rule over all. And this comes through in Romans 9 to 11. I mean, he says in chapter 9 verse 18, so then he has mercy on whomever he chooses, and he hardens the heart of whomever he chooses. 9:21, will what is moulded say to the one that moulds it, why have you made me like this? The old prophetic image of the pot having no right to speak back to the potter. And at the end of Romans 11, he has this kind of doxology where he says, oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. He really wants to focus on just how important God's sovereignty is. But then he's got another non-negotiable, which is he wants to say that there is no turning back from the idea that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the good news for all human beings, Jews and Gentiles. And he has in Romans 10, for example, one of those statements that gets remembered. It's kind of a catchy sort of statement about his view of the gospel. It goes like this in 10:9, if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And 10 verse 12, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and is generous to all who call on him. And he doesn't want in any way to backtrack on that. And he doesn't want in any way to say that the gospel is actually only for some people. It's just for those that have turned to Jesus, and it's not for Israel as a whole. That's not really an option to him as well. So how does Paul cope with the fact that so many Jews in his day have not turned to Jesus? That's the thing that really bothers him. It really causes him anxiety and is the focus of these fascinating chapters, Romans 9 to 11. But one of the things that Paul does in contexts like this is he goes back to the scriptures, his scriptures, which we might call the Old Testament, we might call the Hebrew Bible, we might call it the Greek Bible, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But he goes back to that authority because if you want to understand what the mind of God is all about, what the purpose of God is about, you go to the scriptures and you try and fathom out from there what God's plan for humanity really is. And one of the answers he finds there is an answer that is used lots and lots in the prophets and elsewhere in the Old Testament. And that answer is that there is a remnant. There is a group of people who have remained faithful. It's a real famous Old Testament text. I mean, Elijah the prophet is one who is one of the remnant he sees. There's all these other people that have turned to Baal, but he has remained faithful. Or it's something that you see in Isaiah. And here then in Romans 11, he says, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. At the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. And Paul sees himself as one of those in that remnant. In 11:1 he says, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. But of course, as soon as you said that there's this remnant that has remained faithful to God, then you've got the problem. Well, what about everybody else? Why is it that other people aren't turning to Jesus as Paul wishes that they would? And there he comes up with an answer that goes back again to the sovereignty of God. And he talks about a hardening that's come on Israel. He says that people were ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God. This is Romans 10:3. They were ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God. They sought to establish their own. They've not submitted to God's righteousness. And then he says, for Christ is the end of the law so that there might be righteousness for everyone who believes. And that this happens because Israel fails to obtain what it was seeking, 11:7. The elect obtains it, he says, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a sluggish spirit. And this idea of the hardening of Israel is also quite an Old Testament idea. You see it with the whole idea of Pharaoh having his heart hardened. We kind of, as moderns, find it a difficult idea to get hold of, the idea that people can be blamed when it's something that God himself has imposed on them. But for Paul, it comes as a natural answer because he's saying that God is the one responsible ultimately for doing all of these things. And so then he says, well, if this hardening has come upon Israel, why is it? Why is that part of God's plan? And here is Paul's really innovative move, his interesting move. He says that God has hardened the hearts of Israel in order that Gentiles might come into the people of God, and the Gentiles coming into the people of God come into the people of God in order to make Israel jealous. This is Paul's really interesting move. He says that the nations have flooded in, the nations have turned to Jesus, and that this will in due course make Israel jealous. Look at Romans 11:11. Have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means, but through their stumbling salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Or look at 11:25. So that you may not claim to be wiser than you are, brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon the part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so that's what Paul thinks is happening at the moment in his lifetime, that all these Gentiles are turning to Jesus, that Israel will ultimately see that these Gentiles have turned to Jesus, and they too will turn to Jesus. And what this leads to then is Paul's ultimate answer in Romans 11:26, where he comes out with the remarkable statement, and so all Israel will be saved. All Israel will be saved. That's what Paul states in Romans 11:26. And so that settles it, doesn't it? All Israel, Paul thinks, will be saved. Well, it doesn't quite settle it, because there's the question of what does Paul mean here by all Israel? And do they have to do anything before that moment where God chooses to grant salvation to all of them? What's Paul envisaging here? I think a clue comes in the second part of that verse, Romans 11:26. He quotes a little bit from the Old Testament where he says, as it is written, out of Zion will come the deliverer. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. Now, this character, the deliverer, hochruomenos in Greek, is a character that Paul presumably identifies with Jesus. 1 Thessalonians 1:10, that word is associated with Jesus. So I think what Paul is imagining is that at the end of time, at the eschaton, as Jesus returns, he sees all of Israel turning to Jesus, and that is why all Israel will be saved. So all of these things, like the hardening that's come upon Israel, this remnant that has remained faithful, these are all kind of temporary things before the final consummation of history, when all Israel will turn to Jesus and will be like Paul. And that's really, I think, Paul's solution at the end of Romans 11. Now, of course, this is an unsatisfactory solution to us in many ways, because it kind of implies that the only way that Paul would envisage the salvation of Israel is through Jesus, and that actually isn't a very congenial message for certain ways of discussing Jewish-Christian relations. But I think when you're doing history, one of the things you have to do is say, let's look at what we think Paul is actually saying without trying to kind of make it fit as best we can with our own particular agendas. And that's not to diminish the importance of discussions about Jewish-Christian relations, but to say that I think we have to understand what Paul is saying, and then we can decide whether or not we agree with what Paul is saying and decide how we respond to it. But nevertheless, I think that is what's going on. I think he is projecting a time when Israel will turn to Jesus and they will become like him. He imagines that as he is one of those remnant, that other Jews will follow like him into the people of God who worship Jesus, who have turned to Jesus. I think that's how Paul conceptualizes it. But as always, I might be wrong. There are lots of different views on this, and one of the joys of doing New Testament scholarship is that it's one of those things where we can gather together around the text and look at the secular literature and respond to these things and kind of work out what it is that we think is going on in the text, and have these kind of debates about the history and about what it is that Paul is talking about here. It's a really interesting topic, as always, and thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod, and I should be along again with another one soon. You can find me on the web, of course, at podacre.blogspot.com. I'm on Facebook at NTPod, Twitter at NTPod2, and you can always find me on Duke University's iTunes U. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.